Good day. This is the Corrupt True Crime Podcast, and I'm Charlie Cruz. Today's episode is about a revolutionary medical breakthrough that promised to change healthcare forever, but instead became one of the most stunning cases of deception at the intersection of cutting-edge science and criminal justice. She never blinked, not once during the entire interview. Black turtleneck, red lipstick, and a voice so deep it could have belonged to someone twice her size. Elizabeth Holmes had just become the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, and she was about to revolutionize healthcare with a single drop of blood. Except, here's the thing, the technology didn't work. It had never worked, and she'd just convinced some of the most powerful people in America to bet $700 million on a lie. Now you've got to understand something about Silicon Valley. In tech, there's this religion around disruption. Move fast, break things, fake it till you make it. That approach works fine when you're building a social media app, but when you're running blood tests that tell someone whether they have cancer, breaking things means putting lives at risk. Holmes took the playbook from software startups and applied it to medical devices, and for over a decade, absolutely nobody stopped her. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford when she was 19. Brilliant move, right? That's what Jobs did, what Gates did, what Zuckerberg did. The narrative was already written. Visionary young founder too revolutionary for traditional education. She filed patents for a wearable drug delivery patch, then pivoted to something even more ambitious, blood testing that required just a finger prick instead of those massive needle draws everyone hates. The company was called Theranos, a mashup of therapy and diagnosis that honestly should have been a red flag right there. The device? She named it Edison. Because nothing says I'm definitely not overcompensating like naming your invention after Thomas Edison. Here's where it gets interesting. Holmes wasn't just selling a product, she was selling a vision, and she understood something crucial. In the early days, nobody expects the technology to actually work. Stealth mode, proprietary secrets. Can't show you the details because competitors would steal it. That excuse bought her years of development time, where investors handed over millions without ever seeing a proper demonstration. But the brilliance, and I'm using that word with considerable irony, was the board she assembled. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, William Perry, 4 former US secretaries, titans of American foreign policy and defense. And check this out, not a single one of them had any background in medicine, laboratory science, or healthcare technology. It was like assembling a basketball team to perform heart surgery. But those names, pure gold for credibility. When you're pitching investors and you can say Kissinger's on your board, suddenly nobody's asking the hard technical questions. Now here's where Holmes really showed her hand. She divided the company into silos. Engineers in one department couldn't talk to engineers in another department. Lab workers were kept separate from the people building devices. This wasn't protecting trade secrets. This was making sure nobody could see the whole picture. Because the whole picture was a disaster. The Edison devices couldn't reliably perform even basic blood tests. We're talking about fundamental failures of chemistry and physics. You can't run 200 complex tests from a couple drops of blood. The sample size is too small. The dilution creates errors. The technology doesn't exist. But Holmes had a solution, and it was breathtakingly simple. Just lie about it. When she demonstrated the devices to investors, she used pre-recorded results. The machine would beep and whir, and numbers would appear on screen. Except the machine wasn't actually analyzing anything. It was playing back data from previous tests run on traditional equipment. Theater. Pure theater. Then came the really audacious part. Holmes secured a partnership with Walgreens worth $140 million. Theranos would set up testing centers in Walgreens pharmacies across Arizona and California. Actual patients would walk in, get their finger pricked, and receive blood test results that would inform real medical decisions. Cancer screenings, pregnancy tests, cholesterol levels, life-changing information. And here's the thing about that decision. It's where cleverness crossed into recklessness. Because now, there was evidence. Physical, undeniable evidence that the technology didn't work. Patients started reporting wildly inconsistent results. Someone would test high for thyroid hormone one day and completely normal the next. A woman received a false positive pregnancy test. People were making medical decisions based on these results, stopping medications, starting treatments, having unnecessary procedures. Behind the scenes, Theranos was running most tests on standard commercial analyzers. the exact machines you'd find in any conventional lab. The Edison devices sat unused or were wheeled out only for demonstrations. When they did use the Theranos technology, lab workers had to dilute the tiny finger prick samples to get enough volume, which destroyed accuracy. Then, they'd manipulate quality control data to hide the failures. Holmes's romantic partner, Ramesh Balwani, or Sunny, as he went by, ran operations with her. Here's an odd detail. He was 19 years older, and they'd met when she was 18 on a Stanford trip to China. He was married at the time. Their relationship stayed secret from the board and investors for years, which is a massive conflict of interest when he's the president and chief operating officer. Balwani enforced a culture of absolute secrecy and intimidation. Employees signed oppressive non-disclosure agreements. Anyone who raised concerns was threatened with lawsuits or fired. But you can only contain that kind of pressure for so long before someone breaks.
Building a new product? Temez Labs takes you from napkin sketch to the App Store. Trusted by Fortune 500s for quality, security, and speed. Book your free strategy session at temez.ai.
Tyler Schultz was a lab worker at Theranos. Fresh out of Stanford, idealistic, believed he was going to change the world. He also happened to be George Schultz's grandson. Yes, the George Schultz who was on the Theranos board. And Tyler started noticing problems. Tests that didn't make sense. Data that was manipulated. Quality controls that were fabricated. He did what you're supposed to do. He raised concerns internally. He was told to keep quiet. So he went to his grandfather. And here's where it gets difficult. George Schultz, this legendary statesman, didn't believe his own grandson. He believed Elizabeth Holmes. The family fractured over it. Tyler found himself estranged from his grandfather, threatened with lawsuits by Theranos lawyers, racking up hundreds of thousands in legal bills. But he didn't stop. He contacted regulators. He documented everything. Another lab worker, Erica Chung, was doing the same thing. Multiple employees were secretly gathering evidence, talking to the New York State Department of Health, reaching out to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. The walls were closing in, but Holmes kept raising money, kept expanding, kept doing media appearances where she'd stare into cameras without blinking and talk about democratizing healthcare. Then came John Carreyrou, investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and absolutely the wrong person for Holmes to have looking into a company. Carreyrou started receiving tips from former employees about the problems at Theranos. He began methodically building his case, talking to whistleblowers, reviewing documents, consulting with independent experts who confirmed the technology couldn't work as claimed. Holmes deployed the lawyers. Theranos was represented by Boies Schiller, one of the most prestigious and aggressive law firms in the country. David Boies himself was on the Theranos board and had invested in the company, which should tell you something about objectivity. They sent threatening letters to Carreyrou, to the Wall Street Journal, tried to pressure the newspaper through Rupert Murdoch, who owned the journal and had personally invested $125 million in Theranos. But Carreyrou wouldn't back down. In late 2015, the Wall Street Journal published a prized startup's struggles. The article revealed that Theranos was running most tests on commercial machines, that the Edison devices barely worked, that accuracy was questionable. Holmes went on the offensive media appearances, denials, attacking the journalism. Except now regulators were paying attention. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted a surprise inspection of the Theranos lab. What they found was catastrophic. Deficient practices posing immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Quality control failures. Inaccurate results. Within months, CMS banned Holmes from operating a lab for 2 years. Theranos voided 2 years' worth of blood test results, tens of thousands of tests that patients and doctors had relied on. Walgreens terminated the partnership. Safeway, which had invested millions preparing for a Theranos partnership, pulled out. Forbes revised Holmes's net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. That's not a typo. Her entire fortune evaporated because it had never been real. Just paper valuation based on fraud. The SEC filed civil charges. Then came the criminal indictment, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. Holmes and Balwani were charged with lying to investors, partners, and patients about their technology, revenues, and capabilities. The prosecution had emails where Holmes and Balwani discussed technology failures, while simultaneously telling investors everything was working perfectly. They had patient test results showing wild inaccuracies. They had testimony from the prestigious board members who'd finally realized they'd been duped. The trial lasted 4 months. Holmes took the stand in her own defense risky move that usually signals desperation. Her strategy? Claimed that Balwani had psychologically mistreated her, controlled her, manipulated her into the fraud. It was a dramatic pivot considering their relationship had been secret for years. The jury didn't entirely buy it. Guilty on 4 counts, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors, 3 counts of wire fraud. Acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients, which suggested the jury gave her some benefit of the doubt about intent there. But the investor fraud? Undeniable. The judge sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Holmes had become pregnant twice between indictment and sentencing, timing that raised some eyebrows about strategy. The judge wasn't swayed. She also ordered restitution of $452 million to defrauded investors, though good luck collecting that from someone with no assets. Balwani was tried separately, convicted on 12 counts, sentenced to 13 years. Both appealed. Both lost. Holmes reported to a federal women's prison in Texas in the spring of last year. She won't be eligible for release until the early 2030s.
Oh, hey, friend. Do you like what you're hearing? Now you can have a ridiculously amazing podcast, too. Check out holler.studio to get yourself one today.
Now here's what makes this case fascinating beyond the obvious. This wasn't some unsophisticated penny stock scheme. Holmes convinced Henry Kissinger, one of the most calculating minds in modern politics, that she'd revolutionized blood testing. She convinced James Mattis, a Marine general nicknamed Mad Dog for his strategic thinking, to join her board and invest. These weren't fools. They were titans who got played by a teenager in a black turtleneck. And check this out. Former colleagues claimed the voice was fake, that Holmes used a normal voice in her early 20s, then gradually deepened it over the years to sound more authoritative. The turtlenecks were a deliberate Steve Jobs imitation. The unblinking stare was a practice technique. Everything about her persona was performance art, designed to suggest genius and seriousness. What Holmes understood is that people want to believe in disruption. They want to find the next Jobs, the next Zuckerberg, the next world-changing founder, and the thing about brilliant schemes is that they are seldom brilliant enough, and no matter how clever you are, the house almost always wins. Now, if you enjoyed our show, tap that follow button and 5 stars in our ratings. Catch you next time.
Grep News. Tamez.